And now to our presentation. In the aftermath of last month's election, there has been, understandably, much discussion about Bill Clinton's victory and what the election of the first Democratic president in 12 years portends for the nation. Here in Oregon, the focus has been on the defeat of Measure 9 and whether it will come back in a new form, and recently on our junior senator in Washington and whether he will come back in a new form. With all of this going on and with other factors to ponder, such as the impact of the Year of the Woman in electoral politics, it is easy to overlook a rather foreboding message sent by voters on November 3rd regarding government and politics, both nationally and here in Oregon. Although Bill Clinton was elected, his victory does not appear to be the result of a simple pendulum swing back to traditional pro-government Democratic policies. This was a Democratic candidate, after all, who repeatedly said we can't go back to tax and spend, and who also repeatedly said we don't need more government, we need better government. Bill Clinton also was a candidate that received only 43% of the vote in a presidential election where a third-party candidate received the highest percentage vote of any other candidate, third-party candidate in this century other than Teddy Roosevelt. Meanwhile, in the states, all 15 initiative measures to limit congressional and state legislative terms were approved by an average 2/3 vote. Voters in Arizona and Colorado enacted stringent new tax and spending limits. Voters in New York rejected a spending proposal backed by Governor Cuomo to build new infrastructure in that state. Californians decisively defeated a tax the rich proposal and overwhelmingly repealed that state's tax on junk food, which had been enacted in a prior legislative session to try to balance that state's budget. Here in Oregon, our term limits initiative passed with a 69% vote. The split roll tax proposal was rejected by 75% of Oregonians, and parks funding proposals at both the state and metropolitan levels were rejected. Although the new Metro Charter was passed, one has to wonder what role the wording of the ballot measure title itself played when it used phrase like limit Metro powers and give local voters control of Metro. As national syndicated columnist Neil Pierce observed regarding all of this, in discussing the voters' message across the nation, he said, "When the subject switched to government, the voters turned surly. We don't like politicians, we can't wait to limit their terms. Don't tax us, don't spend our money." Well, what are we to make of all of this? We're fortunate today to have a speaker with us who can help us understand what this is all about and who can tell us what government and politicians ought to do about it. Ted Gabler is the co-author of the best-selling and widely acclaimed book, Reinventing Government, which was published this past February. The full title of the book gives us an idea of Mr. Gabler's message. Reinventing Government, How the Entrepreneurial Spirit is Transforming the Public Sector from Schoolhouse to State House, City Hall to the Pentagon. Among the accolades the book has received is this one from Bill Clinton. Quote, "This book should be read by every elected official in America. Those of us who want to revitalize government in the 1990s are going to have to reinvent it. This book gives us the blueprint." Mr. Gaebler is a resident of San Rafael, California, working as Managing Director of Strategic Services for Municipal Resource Consultants, a state and local government consulting firm. He has a BA in Public Administration from Miami University and a Master of Governmental Administration from the Wharton Graduate School of Business Administration at the University of Pennsylvania. Before entering the consulting field, Mr. Gaebler served over a 20-year period as an assistant city manager and city manager in California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, and I'm pleased to say for 5 years, from 1965 to 1970, started off in his government service working for the city of Salem, Oregon. It is my pleasure to give you Ted Gabler to present his remarks entitled New Ideas on How to Run Government. Ted?
Thank you, Jim. As usual, it is a pleasure to be back in Oregon. For some reason, I love this state. I've worked in 38 different states as a consultant and 5 different states as a city manager. And for some reason, I keep coming back to Oregon. I enjoy the vibrancy that you represent here. In fact, you are perhaps tied with Minnesota for your interest in and support for and long history of progressive government. And so it is a pleasure to be asked to come to the Portland City Club. I also bring you greetings from John Major. I got off the plane last night from London, where I had the pleasure of addressing yesterday at just about this time the Cabinet Office and an international conference attended by 21 different countries, sponsored by John Major as his presidency for the economic community comes to an end, European Economic Community. They entitled it Service to the Citizen, and they were particularly interested in what we in America are doing to reinvent our governments, and so hence the invitation to me. I was dumbfounded to learn that on July 21st of 1991, John Major, as a relatively new prime minister, published a document called the Citizens' Charter, which is designed to give government back to the citizens of Britain. And our book went to the publisher, literally, we hand-carried it in Boston to our publisher on July 1. So there was no possibility of any kind of advance notice or release, early release. 8 of the 10 principles that we highlight in our book are in the Citizens' Charter. So there is a universal problem about government and some universal solutions that are being discovered. And I wanted to share that with you as you think about your Oregon Progress Board and the benchmark system that you have started and now 10 states are replicating. There are a number of things that are being done that seem to be worldwide. Next week I will be meeting with the citizens, the newly elected governor of one of the states in Mexico. And they are coming up to California to talk about what they can do in Mexico. And Brazil has called, and Australia has called, and Singapore. And we've sold the rights in India and China and others to the book. So it is not just something that is uniquely American. It is something that people are paying attention to. That is the restructuring, the reinventing of government. And I want to spend the rest of the time today chatting with you about that. But let me just check this audience, make sure we have the right audience here. How many of you would prefer to have no government of any kind? Oh, good. Good, good. There's usually one person that is an anarchist of some kind. It's a funny thing because we citizens, no matter what country, what age, what continent, have always formed ourselves, if we go beyond the family and clan, we've always formed ourselves into some form of governance. We've always allocated certain things that we want, if you will, the state to do. That's varied greatly throughout history. It's varied greatly throughout the continents. But we, as a species, a human species, seem to be very interested in having governance of some kind. And we've always reserved the right to ourselves to either peacefully or unpeacefully blow up things that don't work. Which leads me then to my second question. How many of you love your governments just the way they are? Once again, you have joined me then, hopefully, as people interested in change. And I know you get a speaker a week, and I was a member of Rotary for 14 years, and I used to think this was a good time for me to gather my thoughts, at least at every Rotary luncheon, because I could sit back and relax and not have to pay attention to the speaker. And I don't much care for that, so I'm hoping that I can enlist you to be change agents. And so I'd like to pose the question for you as I go through my talk today. Could you be asking yourself the question, what is it that you can do, you personally, regardless of your position, regardless of your influence or how long you've been in Portland or Oregon, what is it that you can do to help foster change in government, because it is a very exciting time to be alive, and we need all of us, not just the people who have chosen to be politicians, the people who have chosen to be public servants. We need everybody to be paying attention to what they can do personally to governments. And things do change. The Berlin Wall came down a year or so ago. The Soviet Union disappeared less than a year ago, 11 months or so ago. South Africa has changed. There's tremendous changes going on in government, in institutions, in this country and around the world. Here we have a new president, and we have 12 new governors. And it's astonishing what can be done, what is being done to actually change government. So it's a very exciting time. And I urge you to think as I talk about what it is your role can be. I specifically wrote the book for audiences exactly like you. Now, David Osborne's reason for writing it was a little different. But my interest was in getting to people, not necessarily those who are in government. I assumed they had to read a book anyway, right? I mean, they were kind of trapped into it. There's not very many positive books about government. Last year we had 3 non-positive books, right? The Parliament of Whores, Why Americans Hate Politics, and the United States of Ambition. Our book is a positive book about government. I assume people in government would have to read it. But it's you, the people that are affiliated with government, that are close to it, that care about it, that hate it, that dislike it, that are frustrated by it, that have to see it, they're embarrassed for it, that sometimes are proud of it, pleased with it. It is this group of folks, and by your attendance today, you again emphasize that you are caring about governments. Because I assume that 60 to 70% of people in America are too busy, getting married, getting pregnant, getting education, getting a job, most of Americans don't care. They don't have time to care, and that's fine. There'll come a time, a phase in their life when they'll pay attention as you are. But this is your time. You are in that 30% that do care, and I specifically wrote the book so that a different model of government would be presented, a non-bureaucratic model, a more flexible model, one that's closer to the customers, one that is interested in effectiveness and change, those kind of things, reusing existing resources, not always looking for new resources, working much more in concert and harmony with the citizens rather than doing things from the ivory tower as we've been accused of doing. We know how to do government better. In fact, I would be a rich person today if I had $1 for every time a department head or cabinet level person at the state government told me, we know how to do government better, but they won't let us. They, the city club, they, the ex-council people, they, the developers, they, the Northside Community Group, they, the Rotarians, they, whoever the they is in your communities. There's a perception among we public employees that you won't let us do things, that the range of options that we can consider to changing the circumstances under which we work and therefore the services that you receive, there is an assumption made by us, sometimes true, sometimes not, that you don't want us to change. And we wrote the book so that a different model would be presented, so people like you would not only understand and accept change, but you would demand change. And that's one of the hopes I have today, is that you will walk out of here demanding that your governments change. Let me give you, 2 things. Let me step back and say, I do appreciate the honor of being asked to come here. There are 2 criteria that your city club has to people who speak. One is you want somebody who's good, and I appreciate that. The other problem is you don't have any money. And so if I've interpreted your 2 criteria, you want somebody who's good for nothing. You'll know shortly whether you've not received your... Let me paint the picture of change and why I need you, we all need you to support that in a very vigorous way. Side by side with me, some 15 years ago, was a school superintendent. School superintendent was a good old boy. I was making my 100K, he was making his 100K. He was just the nicest guy you ever want to see. I mean, he was affable. He attended the city club meetings. He shook hands. He belonged to 5 service clubs. He was nice to the parents. I mean, this guy was really a nice guy. He was so nice that the Rotarians made him Citizen of the Year of that community in 1977. Not to be outdone, the Chamber of Commerce 5 years later made him Citizen of the Year again. Twice in his illustrious career, he became Citizen of the Year. By the way, that never happened to me. In fact, I was getting castigated regularly by the newspapers and by the media and by the Rotarians and by the Board of Realtors and others, because I suggested we ought to go out and buy a baseball team and run it for profit. And we did for 10 years, ran a minor league baseball franchise. Let me tell you about the product of that school superintendent. There were 1,000 kids who graduated from that 3 different high schools, plus the continuation school, 1,000 kids for 3 years in a row. How many do you think went on to 4-year colleges at the end of their high school career? I've got time. Just take your time. 30%, 50%, right. How about 4? 4 kids, not 4%, 3 years in a row. 4 kids. I couldn't do economic development as city manager. I couldn't get anybody to move their industry to our town because we had such a terrible school system. And yet the Rotarians and those movers and shakers and the people like you rewarded this guy for a 32-year career of public service because he never, ever made a change in anything, never did anything to shake things up. We change agents need your support. We're not going to do everything right. We're going to do some dumb things, some incredibly dumb things, but we're going to do some incredibly smart things too. And we need your support. The people that you have working for you in government know how to do it better. They don't think you will support their change. And by the way, a caution, because the business community is typically not there to support change in government. You tend to disappear when things get tough. You say behind closed doors and on the golf course, go get them, go get them, we want you to change, yeah, we'd like you to change, take on those public unions. But when the public unions start pouring garbage in front of your bank or pouring garbage in front of your house, all of a sudden you disappear. You're not there to stick with us through the tough changes. And so people evaporate and they don't run for office. They complain about people who do, but they don't run for office and be there for the tough times. So I'm urging you again to look inside yourselves and figure out what is it that you can do to be supportive of changing government. And that's the exciting part. We clearly are in an era where, partially catalyzed by the book, partially catalyzed by other things, where people are in a mood to change things because the cost of staying the same and the ability to stay the same fiscally is just not there. So we are getting some people out there who are looking at things differently. Kind of an aside or word on Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton did endorse, as did a member of the Bush administration, as did Perot, the principles of reinventing government. One of the things I've been most pleased with is not only its worldwide acceptance, but its acceptance by the right and the left and the school districts and the federal government and the Defense Department and the state agencies and county governments and all kinds of people, elected of a government of people and appointed government people, people like you, outside government, people inside government. It seems to be universally accepted in terms of a new model, a new hopeful way of going about and doing government. And that's an exciting kind of thing. Bill Clinton has just been released, we think, because I've been gone out of the country, I'm not sure, but assume that today or tomorrow, the book Mandate for Change has been released as kind of the blueprint of what the Clinton administration will do. And included in there is 2 or 3 chapters focusing specifically on dealing with the outcome measures of government and the processes of reinventing government from the inside. Very similar, by the way, to your Oregon Progress Board. Which is a group of citizens focusing attention for the first time on outcomes rather than inputs. And we have always focused in the past on inputs. So I think you're going to find, and I have a draft copy that is confidential until the book is published, of the things that are being recommended, very specific things about sunsetting programs and overhauling civil service and fundamentally changing the budget system to be outcome-oriented instead of input-focused, and those kinds of things. And Bill Clinton, I suspect, will in fact be putting, as are a number of governors and a number of school superintendents and school boards around the country, putting emphasis on changing government. The single greatest conclusion of our book, after interviewing 300 or 400 governments and chronicling the successes of more than 1,000. The single greatest conclusion is that in government, we have good people trapped in bad systems. Good people trapped in bad systems. Now, that's not to say that every single employee who works for government is good, and I used to fire about 5% of them regularly and fired a department head every 18 months during my 20-some-year career. So clearly there are some people who need to be fired, but by and large, the people who work for government are at least average and basically pretty altruistic and good people. They are frustrated more than you by the systems that we trap them in, meaning the budget system, the accounting system, the procurement system, the communication systems, the agenda processes systems, the lack of strategic planning systems, the woefully slow use of technology, and so on. It is those systems that drive the behavior of the public employee. Now, here's an astonishing fact, and why I think that John Major in England, Bill Clinton in Washington, and others are paying attention to the reinventing of government. How many of you, let me just ask, how many of you work for government? Let's just, okay, now let me just ask you, those people. How many of you could run your programs next year, same programs you're running this year, for 15% less money than you have now if you did not have to follow outmoded, archaic, stupid accounting systems, budget systems, civil service systems? How many of you could do that? And there is your answer. The solution to your downturn in money is not the short-term solutions that you've been looking at, drawing down emergency reserves, deferring capital improvement programs, curtailing or postponing services, downsizing staffs, freezes, layoffs, attrition, creating discretionary taxes on an ad hoc or limited time basis. All of the things we do if there are short-term problems. The real solutions to new money come from two sources. One is reusing the existing money that we already have by eliminating the incentives that drive employee behavior to do crazy, archaic, bureaucratic things. Reutilizing existing money. And the other one is to tap into the full amount of money that is available in the entire community, not just the money that has been laundered through government. And that's a key point. Those are two sources of money. Reuse of existing money and taking the community money and fostering and brokering and acting as a facilitator for that money by doing the steering role rather than by doing the service provision or rowing role, as we say. Now, those are two exciting kinds of things. By the way, in a book, 15 to 30% of the money that government officials say, and we asked every single person we interviewed, 15 to 30% of the money they're spending is spent on following outmoded, archaic systems that they hate. You sort of dislike, because you're sort of affected by them, but the people in government hate them. I'm the one that can't get a reimbursement for 7 months for a $4 ticket. I'm the one that can't hire somebody less than a year because there's been no eligibility list developed. I'm the one that can't get any kind of flexibility in money. I have money set aside in billets, but I can't put it into ordinance, or I can't pull it into housing because it's all locked up in police. As the needs in society change, I can't change the allocation of where my money goes with any kind of a flexible, adaptive way. Now, it has not been very sexy for people to run, of course, for office on the basis of, if you elect me, I will change the procurement system, right? Better accounting practices will come if you elect me. I mean, it does not have a ring. We tend to talk about more global kinds of issues. And yet, what could be more global than 15 to 30% of the money that could be reused? I mean, that's a healthy start toward whatever fiscal problems you have here in Oregon. So we do need people to pay attention. And John Major is the very first world leader that I know of that has stepped forward and said, we have done this all wrong. We are going to turn this around and pay attention to the systems that affect the incentives that drive our public servants' behavior so that the citizens will get better service. A very important kind of thing. Let me elaborate on that for just a moment. We have tried in the past to change government. Remember, you're supposed to be thinking to yourself, how can I change government? Let me try to run through that. We've tried in a variety of ways to change government before. And I'm going to come back to the conclusion that we need to change the behavior of the public employees and give them incentives to do that themselves. The first thing we tried to do in America was to have the Hoover Commission, right? Right after World War II, we had the Hoover Commission. We've had mini Hoover Commissions in many states, and mini Grace Commissions, and the Grace Commission, which kind of left in disgrace. The theory behind that is, if we just get those bright business people to bring their business acumen and focus it on government, by God, the world will be better, right? That's what we need. We need to have that business smarts, because everybody in business is so much smarter than everybody who works in government, that if they would just bring that, well, a funny thing happened on the way to the Grace Commission and the mini Grace Commissions and the Hoover Commissions. The net result is that we ended up with a lot of educated business people about how tough it is to work in an environment where there's no bottom line, and the press is with you constantly day and night, and know what you're doing, and should know what you're doing. Business people found that people who are dedicated their lives to public service really do operate with several handicaps that people in the private sector do not. Peter Drucker, who is obviously world-renowned for his management writing, wrote a book called Innovation and Entrepreneurship a few years ago. And in that, he had a chapter about why business techniques don't work in government. Let me just quote to you a couple of those, if I can. Public service institutions such as government agencies, labor unions, churches, universities, schools, hospitals, and so on need to be entrepreneurial and innovative fully as much as any business does. In fact, they may need it more. And yet, public service institutions and governments find it far more difficult to innovate than even the most bureaucratic company. The forces that impede entrepreneurship and innovation in public service institution are inherent in it and integral to it and inseparable from it. There are three main reasons why this is true. First, the public service institution is based on budget rather than being paid out of its results. Therefore, success in a public service institution is defined by getting a larger budget rather than by obtaining results. And that was frustrating to the business people who found that lack of focus on profit and getting paid on results a confusing thing. Second, a service institution is dependent on a multitude of constituents. In a business that sells its products on the open market, one constituent, the consumer, eventually overrides all the others. A business needs only a very small share of a very small market to be successful. Then, and only then, can it satisfy its other constituents, whether those are shareholders, workers, or the community in which it resides. But it's precisely because public service institutions have no results out of which they are being paid, any constituent, no matter how small, how outmoded, how archaic, has in effect veto power over what government does. A public service institution has to satisfy everyone, or certainly it cannot afford to alienate anyone. And so we find ourselves unable to drop products whose time has passed. In the private sector, 10% of your product line, you drop those resources, run them around to the other side and put it on new products, and you keep cycling through. In government, we have products over here, and they fit the needs of the teen canteen in the World War II era, and the other programs of the model cities, or whatever was driving us in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and we have those resources. And then we add new programs, because now we have gangs and we have homeless, and we keep trying to stretch our resources, and stretch our resources, and stretch our resources, because we never drop anything off of this end. Because every constituent has a veto power over what we get out of, what businesses we decide to shed. And so we have much less flexibility to do that than the private sector. Third, Peter Drucker says, and perhaps the most important reason, is that public service institutions, after all, exist to do good. This means that they tend to see their mission as a moral absolute rather than as anything economic. Economics always seeks a higher or different allocation of the same resources to obtain a higher yield. Everything economic is therefore relative. But in a public service institution, there is no such thing as a higher yield. If one is doing good, then there is no better. Indeed, failure to obtain objectives for the quest of good only mean that efforts need to be redoubled. The forces of evil must be far more powerful than expected and must be fought even further. And finally, this last paragraph, my favorite paragraph from Drucker. For thousands of years, the preachers of all sorts of religions have held forth against the sins of the flesh. Their success has been limited, to say the least. But this is no argument as far as the preachers are concerned. It does not persuade them to devote their considerable talents and energies to pursuits in which results may be more easily obtainable. On the contrary, it only proves that their efforts need to be redoubled. Avoiding the sins of the flesh is clearly a moral good, and thus an absolute which does not admit of any cost-benefit calculation. And so we in government tend to do the same thing. We tend in business to maximize what we do, to optimize what we do. In government, we tend to maximize. As long as there's one uneducated kid, one homeless person, one senior that doesn't have ambulatory care services, we go after it and put more government dollars into that program. The business people found that drove them bananas. So they retreated from their Grace Commissions and their Hoover Commissions back into the safety of their closed boardrooms. The second way we've tried to change government was to have the do-gooders. Right? We have the Portland City Club study things, in harmony, of course, with the League of Women Voters and the academics at Portland State. While you're pleasant people, not a lot has changed because of your efforts to do the studying things. So that not being enough, we then turned, of course, to the big six firms. right? Right, with the Price Waterhouse, the Pete Marwicks, the Coopers and Lybrans, the Arthur D. Little, the Arthur Anderson, all the other Arthurs. Because this is going out to a radio audience, I do not want to admit publicly how many millions of your dollars I have wasted on those kinds of studies. But the point is, the theory behind studies is that if you take enough facts in our left brain society and stack them on top of one another in a very large report with a nice glassy envelope on the top of it, with color pie charts in it, that somehow, and give you 32 copies of it, somehow things will change because the logic will be so overwhelming. 2/3 of governmental reports and studies sit on the shelf and are never implemented. 1/3 in the private sector are never implemented. But there's 2/3 in the public sector that are never implemented because those firms are not around for the tough parts of the implementation when the 75-year police chief looks you in the eyeball, complete with his entire constituency, and says, "What do you mean change? I ain't changing. Hurts my turf." And puts a stop to any effort at change because he has enough political clout to stop anything because he's not driven by a bottom line or by logic. And most of us are usually not driven in terms of turfism by logic. We have to do things more on the soft side, more on the organizational development side, more on changing, if you will, the corporate culture side to make it change. So if those efforts, and finally the last effort at changing government has been to have politicians run as outsiders, right? I mean, Jimmy Carter, send me to Washington, I'm going to clean things up. Reagan, 1980, send me to Washington, I'm going to clean things up. Worked so well for him. Reagan, 1984, send me to Washington, I'm going to clean things up. One of the reporters said, "Excuse me, sir, aren't you in charge now?" It has been a very powerful force for outsiders to run on the basis of cleaning up those mindless bureaucrats and controlling them in City Hall or the county courthouses or the school districts or the State House. It hasn't worked a lot. Jimmy Carter is back to building houses. Ronald Reagan is back to, I'm not sure what he's doing. And it's a major shift in what's happening. Those 5 methods of changing government haven't produced results. What does produce results is to focus on empowering the public employee and re-educating the American public. And empowering the public employee, because they know where the problems are, they know where the concerns are, they know where the systems are doing things that are redundant and dumb, but there is no incentive now for them to do anything other than that. Let's take budgeting for an example. So what we need for you to do is be very supportive of incentives that change public employee behavior. True or false? All governmental budgeting systems have a built-in incentive for public employees to spend money. We are a $1 trillion industry, we at the state and local government level. The feds by themselves are $1.6 trillion. We at the local government level, there's 82,000 local governments, are a $1 trillion industry. We have 15 to 30% of the money that we have, of that $1 trillion, that we can reutilize differently if we have different incentives. And yet we have a budget system, not given to us by us public employees, but given, in fact, by we public employees, given to us by do-gooders, by people at the turn of the century, and by others, that demand that we public employees spend money. Because A, if we try to save it, we don't get to keep it. Not personally, of course, but in our departments. B, we don't get as much next year if we don't spend it all this year. And C, we get yelled at for asking for too much last year. So there's a 3-way whammy right off the bat. For us 18.4 million Americans who work for government, 1 out of 9 Americans work for government. And we have an incentive for all of us to be spending money. And by gosh, most of us think we're doing God's work, right? My wife builds homeless shelters and comes home each night and says, "I got babies off the street tonight," and has that sparkle in her eye, like she really is doing God's work. My daughter is a children's librarian in Spokane, Washington, and she thinks she's doing God's work. Now, my son works for the Census Bureau in Washington, D.C., and he doesn't think he's doing God's work, but at least he thinks he's doing society's work. there are incentives in our systems that can easily be changed. And by the way, there is a system of budgeting called ECB, Expenditure Control Budgeting, that is, I would commend to you, was invented in 1979 in Fairfield, California. The Defense Department is now doing it, using it. Texas is now using it. Lots of cities and counties are using it. And essentially says that you get to keep the money, or some portion of it there, unless your finance directors act as a taxing agent, that you save. So all of a sudden you have every employee, all the way down to the police cadet and the police dispatchers and others, trying to save money, not just management trying to save money, because you get to keep it in your department. Right now, departments nationally are turning back 1.2% of their budget at the end of the year. They're not overspending, but they're turning back 1.2%. If you encourage them to save, you'll find them saving 8 to 9% a year, which means that saving money and allowing them to keep it is going to produce more money for you than allowing them to spend all the money they have now under the current budget systems. So changing budgeting systems, not very sexy, but something that has a tremendous, important bang for the buck. Procurement systems are another, and accounting systems that do not allow us to have incentives for keeping revenues. 18.4 million Americans work for government. How many of them do you think have revenue responsibilities? About 5 or 6 in every agency, right? I mean, you have a treasurer and an auditor and a tax collector and an assessor and a finance director and a deputy revenue officer and about those 5 or 6 people, maybe a city manager or county government, different folks. You have those people paying attention to the revenue side, and all the rest of us are trained spenders of money. What if we just asked one time, what can you folks do to make money on a non-fee, non-tax basis? Can you imagine what would happen to your public employees if you asked them that question? They can come forward with answers. 10 years ago, I asked our police department, what is it that you folks can do to make money for yourselves? They said, what? I said, how can you make money for yourselves? We said, we don't have to do that. I said, why is that? They said, because we're the boys in blue. We're beloved by the business community. Anytime we want money, we just go talk to the business community, and they jump on the elected official's head, and we get money poured down to us at the expense of libraries and churches and schools and all the other recreation programs, because we are the fair-haired people. And I said, well, that's right. You've been playing the business community like a violin for years, but that's not going to be something that exists for a long time. You're going to have to figure out ways of making money. So they said, okay, we'll give you an hour. In 1 hour's time, they came up with 52 ways of making money, only 3 of which were illegal. I submit to you that is a whole lot better percentage than the private sector comes up with when they sit around thinking about how to make money. Having been in the private sector now for 8 years. 49 legal ways of making money that grunt-level cops came up with 10 years ago. There's a tremendously untapped way of making money. We have tended to think in government and governance about how we can make money, or how we can spend tax dollars. There is a tremendous amount of dollars out there. Let me just give you the second one. We talked about empowering the employees. Let's go to the citizens for the second one. And then I want to wrap it up and bring it for your questions. In your own quality of life, your family, not in your official positions, but in your family, what percentage of your family's quality of life services do you now spend on state or local government programs? Let's think about that. You buy your food at Safeway, you pay your mortgage payment to a bank for your house at shelter, which is certainly quality of life. You go to a private dentist, you have your car through the credit union, you go to Video Droid or Blockbuster's Video or the local movie theater, or the Theater Arts Guild or ASYO for your soccer programs. You give money to the battered women's shelter. You give to a church of your choice. What exactly is it in your quality of life that you spend or launder through government? And the answer is, we as a nation spend 12% of our budget on government services. And 88% we spend on nonprofit or private sector agencies. Now that's an astonishing turnaround, because you as citizens have 88% of the money. We in government only have 12. And you focused all your effort and energy on how we spend the 12, and you want to limit that, and people want to have cutbacks, and we've passed Prop 5, we've done all those kinds of things to have it. When in fact, we're a tiny little piece of what contributes to your quality of life. But if you asked our government people what you do for a living, They would proudly puff out their chest and say, we provide for the quality of life services of our community. Nonsense. We provide almost 10%, 12% of the quality of life services that you people enjoy, and your kids enjoy, and your parents enjoy. That's a very different mindset. The question is now, what can government do? Since 88% of our quality of life dollars are not under our purview, what can we do to broker or leverage or act as a catalyst for enhancing the quality of life services? And one of the things we can do is step out of the service provision role and into the role of being a broker, catalyst, facilitator. The original Greek word for government meant to steer, not row. And somehow during the last 60 years of the Roosevelt era, we have gotten a nation wedded to the idea of being clients rather than intelligent buying consumers. And we have made them dependent rather than independent. And what we need to do is grow back responsibilities by empowering the citizenry as well as ourselves. And the exciting thing about that is that we as a nation are very willing to be re-educated about the roles we want our governments, plural, to play. We are very willing to be educated about a variety of things. In fact, 90% of what we know, we've learned since high school. We've learned about red meat and cholesterol and satellite dishes and cellular phones and CDs and Herzegovina, Bossa Nova, and whatever the various, the African countries, and Russia is a country now and not a part of the Soviet Union. And there are 32 African nations have different names than when I took geography. We have learned a tremendous amount, and we are very willing to have somebody re-educate us. Who is re-educating us about the options that government has and what role we can play in a much less intrusive way to enhance the quality of life services that there are so many providers out there for now that we're getting competition on virtually everything we do. There's a tremendous re-education that needs to occur, and it needs to start with groups like yours. I commend you for being change agents. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of people in government who are willing to do all kinds of innovative things, including shed services and toss all the dollars we have on the table and figure out what it is that what role you want us in government to play. At the same time, you figure out what role you want the ecumenical councils to play and the service clubs to play and the civic organizations and the industrial council and everybody else in society who is contributing to the quality of life services. We are willing to put our marbles on the table and have the rest of society do the same thing. We need your help, your intelligent, concerned help, in doing that. Now, let me just close by saying, and we'll take questions in a minute, that I was going to write a book that had a very different title. It was going to be called 11 Proven Methodologies for Affecting Bureaucratic Change Without Unnecessarily Upsetting the Budget System or any of the other people who have turf in government. And my wife looked at me and said, that's boring. You're in the private sector now. You got to have some pizzazz. You can't do that bureaucratic nonsense. You got to get, I said, okay, I understand. I got to do marketing. All right, same book content, just a different book title. I'm going to call it Sex and the City Manager. She looked at me in the way that only wives can and said, what in the world makes you think that would be less boring? Thank you.
Our first question today will be asked by Susan Stone.
First, like to say I think the City Club did maximize its dollars, and we really did get something for nothing. These are wonderful ideas that you've presented, but some of us get this overwhelming sense that we've got another plan here and we don't know how to get started. Could you talk to us about the next step we as individuals could take to start implementing these changes?
There are lots of ways. The first, I think, that you can do as a group of citizens, which is different than what people in government can do, as a group of citizens, is to immediately stop rewarding longevity. Quit giving people 20-year pins. If they stayed 20 years, they're probably not doing what you want them to do. I recognize there are probably some senior government people in here who are very proud of their 20 and 30-year pins. That's one thing. We need to focus again. Everything you do in the business community is read by the people who work in government. If you kill the messenger for some change effort, everybody else says, look what happened to Charlie. In fact, back in 1962, old Charlie Bill, tried something new in government, and he got his head handed to him by the city club, and by golly, and the Oregonian on top of it. And nobody has ever made an innovation since that time because of that. We in government get paid to do our job. We do not get paid to innovate. Absolutely do not get paid to innovate. There's been no incentive. And so one of the things you can do is foster the spawning of what I call new idea offices. When I ask government people, where's your office of new ideas? They have a difficult time answering that. And it's hard to imagine with 18.4 million minds that we don't have a direct avenue for those minds to come forward with new ideas. So spawning and sponsoring in public employees, having an avenue to go to somebody with their new ideas, to be heard, to have a forum, maybe some industrial or service club people involved in it, and not have to go to their first line supervisor, where most ideas get killed if there's somebody, because that's where they come. They come to the first line supervisor, the sergeant says, that's nice, Charlie, but get your ass back out on the street, you're late, and that idea is killed. And so we need to have a sponsoring by the business community of the change and new ideas and support for those kind of things.
My name is Tom Slayton. In view of the fact that Senator Packwood either concealed or actively may have misled some people about what he'd done and then got reelected, in view of the fact that in past times our government has told us that DDT was absolutely safe, that nuclear power would save us in the future, what can we do besides unelecting somebody or not bringing them back when they run for re-election to make sure that our public officials tell us the truth and acknowledge that they don't know something when they don't know something?
Let's see, a couple of comments about that. I'm not so sure that the churches didn't mislead us through most of the Middle Ages and others about whether or not the earth was flat or we were the center of the universe. I mean, a lot of our institutions throughout history have misled us. I'm not sure that we're going to correct that issue. The more relevant point, I think, for this audience is I tend to think that, even though I worked for elected officials for all those years, I tend to think of them as somewhat irrelevant. Because nobody believes them anyway. I mean, right? We want to throw the rascals out, and we convince our neighbor to take time out of their life and run for office, and and we know them as neighbors. And the minute they get elected, we call them politicians, and nobody believes them anyway. So I'm not sure that politicians generally, at any level, school district, city council, county, state, or federal, I'm not sure that we believe. There's 660,000 of them. There's 18.4 million people who work for government. I think, and God knows how many citizens. I think that it's a cop-out to somehow think that the elected officials are where we should focus our energy. The real cost of government and the real chance for change are the people who are going to be there year after year after year after year. So concentrating on things that you can do to foster change among the lifers is probably a whole lot better than bang for the buck than dealing with the politicians who speak for publicity and sound bites and those kinds of things. America's kind of turned off of that, and we are too. Now, the other side of the coin is that I don't think it's right for citizens to think they don't have responsibilities once they elect somebody. And we have 60-some years of citizens backing off saying, well, it must be a government problem. I sure hope government does something about that. And I was particularly imbued with that attitude in England. It must be government's problem. There's no sense of responsibility that people have for doing things themselves. That's why I've been so delighted to see the recycling movement, to see the initiative for the bottle bill that came here, the initiative for K through 5, 1-year-old through K education, early childhood education is largely not a government initiative. It's largely being done by the private sector and by co-ops and Montessori and other kinds of things. MAD is done by the private sector. ASYO is done by the private sector. Citizens need to, neighborhood watching, community-based policing, all those things are where citizens need to step back up to the plate in some portion of their lives, not as elected officials, but as citizens, and play some role in delivering services.
Thank you.
Given the clock, this is one last question.
Sandy Marin, City Club member. You talked about how to reinvent government. How would you apply those principles to the private sector?
Actually, we've been pleased that the book is being used in private sector management classes. in a variety of ways. I think the principles are the reason why let's turn around. Tom Peters wrote, along with Bob Waterman, In Search of Excellence 10 years ago. And had in the following books, Thriving on Chaos, set forth the principles that the private sector needs to operate by. We only have one overlap in our chapter, and that is the customer orientation chapter, because there's lots of things we need to do in government that the private sector takes automatically. We say you should be more profit-driven. Well, there wouldn't be any point saying that to a private sector business, because that's understood. It's automatic for them. We're saying find ways of having public employees, find ways of being an owner. So I think there are ways that we can use the principles, obviously, of empowerment of employees, clearly direct parallel there. The quality circles that we talk about that are being used in the private sector and public sector, all those kinds of things are ways that we could do it. Let me make a comment about that, if I can. We in our book are not advocating that governments act or be run like a business, as you heard me say, because we really do not want, I don't think you want, our government policy and service decisions made overnight by one person behind closed doors strictly for the basis of profit. We really don't want it that way. We'd rather have our government decisions made much more openly, a little bit longer period of time, more inclusiveness of people who are at the table making those decisions, and maybe profit is one of the criteria, but certainly not the sole criteria. And so the model we have is entrepreneurship. If we can get the public employee to feel like they're owners, responsible for the revenue side and the expenditure side, responsible for dropping products, adding products, changing things, being customer-oriented, doing public opinion surveys, finding out what customers feel about their services, finding every way they can to satisfy those customers, getting money from the customer for all those kind of services that we can do that in. If we can get the public employee to act as owners, which is the entrepreneurial model, not the corporate model. We're clearly not saying, Sears and Bank of America are every bit as bureaucratic, as the state of Oregon. There's no difference in the bureaucracy in the incentives that drive the employees. But we're trying to get it so that the public employees will act more flexibly, more like owners, and we think that can come about.
As we adjourn, we can't pay him, but we can show him our gratitude. So as we adjourn, let's give Ted a round of applause. Thank you.